Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another RedGamingTech.com video where I, Crimson Rain, will be taking a look at something a bit different from next generation consoles for once, and instead I'll be taking a look at Alien Colonial Marines with some news and interviews that have been kind of released from some of the developers. Some of you may remember my own videos from the game, and if not, you've probably read your own reviews, whether it's from IGN, Eurogame, or whatever the hell you've read. You've probably, or hell, you might have been unfortunate like myself and actually bought the bloody thing, and you may have realised it was one of the worst actual games that I've played in a while. And while it might sound a bit harsh, I mean, the game itself wasn't actually that bad. I've played worse games, and that's the truth of it. However, there were so many bugs that kind of kept on interrupting the game, and there were so many missed opportunities in the game. If it had been called something else, if it had been called, Jack's Killathon 3000, then I'd have probably have rated it, to be honest, like, an average-ish kind of game, especially if they fix a couple of the bugs. However, as it wasn't scary. It had more bugs in it than, well, a termite mound. It had an absolute ridiculous amount of graphical glitches and various other bits and pieces. And suffice to say, it just wasn't nowhere near as good as what it could have been. Now, bear in mind that this title has actually been in development, or was, shall I say, in development for around 6 years in various iterations. In other words, it wasn't as though it was just kind of put together in just a couple of months or something like that, or was it? So anyway, let's jump right into this. Now, one of the reasons a lot of people are upset is there was a pre-release demo, which was very impressive graphically. Indeed, developers showed off very impressive images. The graphics were certainly a lot better, much better textures, much better lighting, and so on. And it kind of made people say a simple phrase that just kind of echoed around the internet: what the hell happened with this game? I mean, how do you go from that to this? It's almost like saying, you're looking at Crysis 3 1 minute in the demos, and then you go back to like Doom 1 type of effects. Okay, I exaggerate for effect, but you get the idea. And as it turns out, it's not a very simple story. It's kind of a story of developers' finances. It's a story of people trying to salvage the game. Now, as you may know, Sega got the rights to produce a couple of Alien games back in 2006. This was an RPG from Obsidian, and I'm sure you guys know what Obsidian have made, so I'm not going to go into that, and an FPS from Gearbox. So Gearbox themselves were mostly known for titles such as Brothers of Arms and the Half-Life expansions. There were a couple of them, but for example, Opposing Force. And the games themselves were actually pretty good, to be fair to Gearbox. But unfortunately, times roll on, and as you may know, Sega wasn't doing so well financially. Obviously, they got crippled when they went out the console market, but then they started to somewhat recuperate their losses. And then 2009 rolled around and they lost even more cash. So what happened is that, well, they had to nuke one of the franchises. They had to nuke one of the games that was in development, and they decided to go with the RPG in this case. Now, I know what you're going to say. What about the DS game 2010, Alien Infestations? Well, that doesn't really seem to be the original idea behind it. I'm not exactly sure on that, but I'm just going by what I'm reading in various locations here. Now, those of you with a sharp wit and mind might think to yourselves, well, Gearbox have also done other things. They've done, well, Borderlands, right? And indeed they were. And what happened, of course, is that Borderlands, the original, turned out to be an immensely popular game. In other words, it was so successful that Gearbox said, hey, you know what, we want to focus on the second title. In other words, we want to focus on the sequel. And consequently, you've only got a certain amount of people to develop a game. As I've mentioned before, this is the problem with more and more complicated titles. So you've only got a certain amount of people to work on a game. So you can either hire in more people, which sometimes isn't financially viable, especially as obviously you've got a certain amount of office space, you've got a certain amount of equipment, and even if you discount all of that, you've got to make sure those people are vetted, good enough to handle the job, and so forth. Therefore, it's often better to simply farm it out to another company. And in this case, they did that. And they went with the people who made Section 8. The developer are known as Timegate, and this was in 2010 in November. Now, it turns out originally these guys actually had a pretty good working relationship. But the problem with any good working relationship is that it doesn't always maintain as a good working relationship. And what basically happened from the research I'm doing here is that it turns out that Gearbox hadn't actually done too much with the title, Aliens I'm talking about. And instead they'd been focusing on, of course, Borderlands 2, and of course Duke Nukem Forever. And so because of this, the title had been left in the back burner, which is surprising actually. I mean, okay, I know Duke Nukem Forever, in theory, could have, created quite a lot of cash for the for the studio, although we know how buggy and terrible it was. But you know, Aliens Colonial Marines had, cash signs written all over it, in my opinion. And I believe it was Yahtzee who said maybe perhaps the studio had a crippling fear of money and success. Perhaps they did, although he didn't really refer to this particular title, but I'm just going to paraphrase him there. So regardless, now, of course, Timegate have the title and they're trying to develop from it, trying to salvage what Gearbox themselves had managed to, or what should I say, little Gearbox had done. Now here's where the information becomes a bit diluted. What is clear is that Timegate have said that Gearbox basically did very little with the game, and indeed they even said some of the assets, and assets, in case you're wondering, would be models, voice pieces, textures. You get the idea now. In other words, the various bits and bobs that go in to make the game. It could even be, for example, drawings and so forth. For example, sketches and concept art of the game, because obviously you're going to hand all that over to a new team so that they can actually know what direction the game's going in. Regardless, they said that they just didn't really seem to fit into the title. Now, obviously, that doesn't necessarily preclude that they didn't. It doesn't necessarily mean that, they just kind of bashed it together with a hammer and nail. It merely means that they just didn't really make sense, and of course Timegate didn't really understand what the hell they were doing. So regardless, this is where the story becomes a bit unclear. Timegate said that they were able to salvage some of the stuff. They just had to heavily reiterate. So in other words, they had to just say, okay, some of this works, but we're just going to toss everything else out. Another person, however, has said that that's not true. In other words, they said that they had to start completely fresh. In other words, it would be the equivalent of you writing an entire Word document and then you just think a couple of hours later, you know what, this is terrible, and then you just shift delete it and then just create the whole thing again. So yeah, bit of a divergence, but regardless. Now, despite what most people think, video games do usually require a script, whether it's World of Warcraft, which of course has a very heavy script, although people do bitch about the lore all the time being altered and blah blah blah, even down to Halo. You know what's going to happen. In other words, you have a start, you have a middle, you have an end, and whether you're going to save the galaxy or whatever, unless it's like a racing game. For example, Gran Turismo doesn't really have what you could call a script, but most of the time you need a script, even in an FPS title. And so, well, the problem became with this game is they didn't seem to have one. There were several sources who have said that Gearbox and Timegate together had rewrote the game tons of times. So imagine you're a designer and you're told, hey, you need to develop this part for this particular section, right? So let's say, for example, just a complete arbitrary, example. Let's say you're playing Alien Colonial Marines and the script tells you that you're going to be going onto a planet and, that planet has, a certain area in it that's kind of blue and there's lightning in the sky and all that, but then so you spend all your time developing that one level or that section of the planet, and suddenly the script developer says, hey, you know what, that actually doesn't really work for us anymore because we're going to kind of change this around, so yeah, you got to kind of scrap that. And obviously that's taking away development time. It's that simple. Consequently, this just meant that most of the team were just guessing of what to do. So, in other words, they didn't really even know what was really happening. And indeed, Sega apparently, and this is just a claim, no one's actually really confirmed it, but they had said that they wanted to make it more like Call of Duty, with more human combat and less, riddling of bugs and bullets, as they put it. Now, another problem with this is that both Timegate and Gearbox had very, very, very different approaches to the game. And because no one could really agree with what was happening, in other words, you would write a section so many times over and then you had to kind of dilute it because, it's almost the equivalent of trying to cook for two people. One person absolutely hates spice, one people absolutely love spice. So then you kind of get to a point where it's so watered down for both tastes, you think, it's okay, and that's all it's ever going to be because, it just doesn't really work. And what really happened is, apparently, Gearbox used the motto of work, 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 iterate, iterate, and Timegate used the exact opposite. They just basically wanted to ship the product out, and of course that basically meant even more friction in the camp, so to speak. Indeed, a source even says, and I quote, that there was an escort mission which involved a scientist following the player around who would in turn out to be a spy for a military corporation. But the stage was completely scrapped, and the reason behind this is, and I quote, because escort missions are stupid, and we just spent a lot of time trying to make the game shippable. Okay, I know what you're going to say. Okay, so that indicates this crappy script. That even gives me an indication of what the hell happened with, the terrible, bugs in some locations. But what about the other stuff? Well, what about the really impressive looking demo? Well, and I quote on this, the very impressive final game demo, before pre-final game demo, was built by Timegate, and some of the animation itself was by Gearbox. Now, the system they were running on, in other words, the PC, was on a very, very high-spec machine. So, in other words, it's a good possibility that, okay, you might own it, you could own it, but it's more likely you're not going to own such a high system. So, in other words, it had kind of like the best in it, kind of like an SLI or high-end crossfire rig. They don't really go into the actual specifics here. And they were told through the demo production, don't worry about performance, just make it awesome. And there was a reason the demos were never playable. And now this is the real kicker. Reality has to set in at some point here. So you've made the game to look really awesome on like the highest spec machine. Unfortunately, now it has to be optimized for the average system, in other words, kind of the lower spec ones, and they constantly had to cut back more and more for the shader, the particle densities, the textures, because of the memory restraints. Remember, this is still a couple of years ago when, the average system didn't really have, 8 gigs or 16 gigs of RAM with, 3 gigabyte graphics cards. As it turns out now, it's not so bad. Another point as well is they didn't heavily optimize it, but now you've got to remember that you've got another problem. You want to guess what that is? That's right, consoles. And so the problem was now that they couldn't even get the damn thing to run on a PlayStation 3. And another source has said that they didn't actually, they made massive changes to the lighting, to the textures, to the shader complexities. Design elements were altered or even completely redone. So despite the fact that a lot of the assets from Timegate remained intact, the exception of a lower resolution texture and faster performing shaders, all of that together means that, quite simply put, the game's going to look worse. Now, to be fair and give Alien Colonial Marines some credit, there were some sections of the game, lighting wise, that didn't look that abysmal. They actually looked reasonable. They weren't exactly, Far Cry at night kind of level of, nice looking lighting, but they weren't bad. They were at best acceptable. Okay, so now the game's 9 months from the release, and Gearbox knew at this point that the game was a travesty. It was terrible. It was a disaster area. On the other hand, they had to pick up the pieces and try to fix the game, patch it, if you will, with, well, basically duct tape and prayer, I think is the technical term here. After all, you can't ask Sega after, well, what is about 5 years and 3 months, hey, you know what, I know we've got a release date in another 9, but as it turns out, we've absolutely done nothing with this game. It's just about running, if you can say that. I mean, it kind of runs, maybe not on the PlayStation 3, and maybe not on any of our other target systems, but it kind of runs. You can't say that. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's gonna, Sega are just gonna can the project or something. It's just not gonna happen. And so they had to just try to make the game. And a source, and I quote, said the game feels like it was made in 9 months. And to be fair, I'd agree with that. And he said, and that's because effectively it was. So now bear in mind that all of this stuff isn't actually 100% confirmed. As I said, they're anonymous sources, they're rumours, and so forth. But I wouldn't be surprised if at least partially some of this is true. And this is another point that I was going into a while back. I'm probably going to release another video specifically targeting this actually. But it turns out that games now are a lot harder to code for than what they were, say 10 years ago. And this is what I was saying to you in another video, that you can't really expect the PS4 games and the Xbox 720 and of course extension on the next generation of PC to continuously look amazingly better, because the coding for the games, it becomes that much harder. And as I was saying as well, yes, you start getting better engines. Yes, those engines do take a lot of the work away from you. Yes, the extra power of the consoles does make it a lot easier, but you've also got to bear in mind that the more complicated the game is, the more complicated the AI you're writing is, the more complicated the scripts become, the bigger the set pieces are. And a really great example of this would be Final Fantasy VII. Could you imagine trying to remake Final Fantasy VII right now with PS4 level graphics? Now, I know you're probably drooling at that before, but more to the point, imagine just how complicated and how long and how costly it would be to develop each of those characters in turn in high resolution models and every single level, and then all the materia, all the different spells. It would be extremely costly. That's the problem with next generation gaming. In this case, it wasn't necessarily just because of that. One of the issues, of course, was quite simply put, they kept on farming out the projects to different companies. They didn't have enough time or budget. They ran out of time in terms of the end game, and all of these things contributed to the rather lackluster and terrible game that was known as Aliens Colonial Marines, which, in my opinion, was definitely one of the worst big games that I've ever played. Anyway, hopefully this rather lengthy video has answered some of your questions, and I will hopefully see you around in the not too distant future for further videos. So take care of yourselves and have a great day. Bye for now.